When the stage lights went down, everyone was applauding, but Steve McQueen was alone. Hollywood's highest-paid star, the man millions admired, sat in his trailer that night with a glass of whiskey staring out the window. Nobody knew that the real captivity was behind those studio doors. 1967, Los Angeles. Steve McQueen's name was everywhere, from Bullock's store windows to the billboards on Sunset Boulevard. It was the first week of shooting the Thomas Crown Affair, and production was going perfectly. But that somber expression on Steve's face was a truth even the makeup crew couldn't erase. When he arrived at the trailer at 6 a.m, his assistant Sarah found him in shock. Steve McQueen was one of Hollywood's most disciplined stars, but that morning was different. The dark circles under his eyes revealed he'd spent the night awake. "Are you okay, Steve?" Sarah asked with concern. Steve turned and looked at her. In that moment, Sarah saw something in the eyes of the man she'd known for years that she'd never seen before. It wasn't fatigue. It was defeat. "They want script changes," Steve said, his voice harsh, echoing inside the trailer. "They don't want my character to ride a motorcycle. They say it's too dangerous." Sarah hesitated. She knew how Steve reacted to these kinds of directives, but this time was different. This wasn't just a scene change. For Steve, this meant losing another piece of his freedom. "The insurance companies," Sarah began. "Insurance companies, the studio, producers," Steve interrupted. "They all say the same thing. You're too valuable, Steve. We can't take risks, but nobody asks what I want." But the truly shocking thing was the decision Steve made that morning. At 9 o'clock, he was on set. The lights were positioned. The camera was ready. Director Norman Jewison was explaining the scene to Steve. He would walk through a luxury hotel lobby, approach the reception desk, exchange a few lines. A simple, routine scene. "Ready, Steve?" Norman asked. Steve nodded. The camera started rolling. But Steve didn't move. Seconds passed. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. The crew started looking at each other. Then Steve turned and walked off the set. Norman watched after him in astonishment. Steve, where are you going?" Steve didn't even look back. He walked straight to the parking lot, got on his Triumph motorcycle, and rode out through the studio gates. The Pacific Coast Highway was quiet. Steve had the throttle wide open, going 100 miles an hour. The wind hit his face, bringing tears to his eyes. But these weren't tears. It was freedom. He didn't know how much time had passed. Maybe an hour, maybe more. Finally, he stopped in a small coastal town. He didn't take off his sunglasses to avoid being recognized and walked into a cafe. There were only a few people inside. An elderly couple, a man reading a newspaper in the corner, a red-haired waitress behind the counter. Nobody recognized him. Or they did, but didn't care. "Black coffee," Steve said, sitting at the counter. The waitress looked at him and smiled. "Long road?" Steve looked at his motorcycle, the Triumph visible through the window. Yes, a very long road. When his coffee arrived, he took the first sip. It was hot, bitter, real. Sitting here, far from that sterile, controlled world of Hollywood, being nobody, he felt a comfort he hadn't experienced in years. But when the phone rang, that peace was shattered. The waitress answered the phone from under the counter. She listened, then looked at Steve. "They want to talk to you?" Steve's heart raced. How did they know? How did they find him? He picked up the phone. "Yes?" "Steve, there's complete panic here." It was producer Robert Relia's voice, angry and worried. "Norman's going crazy. The insurance companies are furious. The studio could sue you. Come back immediately." Steve didn't answer. He just listened. "Steve, listen to me. I know you're having a hard time, but you have a contract. Millions of dollars are at stake. People's jobs, careers, and my life?" Steve asked, his voice low but resolute. "My freedom? Have you ever thought about those?" That's when everything changed. Robert took a deep breath on the phone. "Steve, I'm going to tell you something, and I'll never tell anyone else. You're right. This system is destroying us, too. But there's nothing we can change right now. Come back. Let's finish this project, and then you can live however you want." Steve took another sip of his coffee. The waitress was watching him, curious. That elderly couple was still talking quietly. Life went on. "I'll come tomorrow," Steve said and hung up. The next morning, Steve wasn't on set. 9 o'clock came, 10, 11. Norman Jellison was pacing nervously. Studio executives were having meeting after meeting. Some were talking about firing Steve, others about filing lawsuits. Around noon, the sound of a motorcycle was heard in the distance. Everyone turned to the door. As Steve McQueen entered through the studio gates on his Triumph, he slowly came to the parking lot, turned off the engine, removed his helmet. Nobody said anything. The crew watched him silently. Steve got off the motorcycle, walked to his trailer, put on his costume, got his makeup done. Then he came to the set. "I'm ready," he told Norman. Norman looked at him. That gloom from the previous day wasn't on Steve's face. Instead, there was a different expression, acceptance or perhaps quiet rebellion. Norman wasn't sure. "Camera," Norman called. The scene went perfectly. One take. Steve was in character, focused, professional, but everyone noticed something had changed. There was a new weight in Steve's movements, his speech, his gaze. During the lunch break, Norman found him. "Steve, what happened yesterday?" Steve looked at him. "There's something you need to remember, Norman. I love this work. Acting, the camera, the set. I love it all. But you can't tell me who I am. You can't tell me how to live, how to breathe." Norman nodded. "I understand, and I respect that. But we can't change the system, Steve." "Maybe I can't fight the system," Steve said, a cold determination in his voice. "But I can set my own rules. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet." From that day on, filming continued. But Steve established a new working arrangement with the crew. He offered ideas for scenes that weren't in the script. He added his own touches to his character. And most importantly, he insisted on being his own stuntman. "The insurance companies won't allow it," the producer said. "Then I won't pay for the scenes I do," Steve said. "I'll take my own risks." This was unprecedented. A star taking responsibility for his own safety. But Steve didn't give up. And finally, the studio had to agree. The day they shot the first action scene, the set was filled with tension. It was a car chase scene. Steve was at the wheel, the camera crew in the back seat. The director was giving instructions over the radio. "Steve, you don't need to go fast. Just make it look natural." But when Steve hit the gas, everyone held their breath. The car glided down the road. Steve's hands had perfect control on the wheel, accelerating at times, slowing at others, every movement calculated. When the scene ended, the crew applauded. Norman smiled. "That was perfect, Steve." Steve got out of the car, sweating, but with a gleam in his eyes. A gleam he hadn't seen in a long time. He was alive. But the nights were still hard. When Steve returned home to that big, empty house in Beverly Hills, silence greeted him. His wife, Neil, was sometimes on tour, sometimes on another project. They could no longer ignore the cracks in their marriage. One night, Steve sat in the living room looking at old photographs from his childhood with his mother, from his days at the orphanage, those difficult years, times spent in poverty. Now he was one of the most famous men in the world, but that old loneliness was still inside him. The phone rang. It was late. Who could be calling? "Steve," a familiar voice. James Garner, his close friend and rival.
"Jim, how are you?"
"Good. I was worried about you. I heard you walked off the set." Steve laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. News travels fast. "Steve, listen. I know how you feel. I've been there. This business has a dark side. But don't forget, you're not just an actor. You're Steve McQueen. When people watch you, they see freedom." "Wait a minute. Don't miss this detail." Steve didn't answer. James's words might be true, but that freedom was only on screen. In real life, Steve was imprisoned by a contract, by expectations, by an image. "Jim, let me ask you something. Are we really free, or are we just living in an expensive cage?" James remained silent. Then he took a deep breath. Maybe both. Maybe freedom is an illusion, Steve. Maybe what matters is finding real moments within that illusion. After hanging up, Steve thought about James's words, real moments. Yes, they existed. When he was on the road on his motorcycle, when he was acting in front of the camera, in the scenes where he did his own stunts. In those moments, for a few seconds, he was truly free. When filming wrapped on the Thomas Crown affair, Steve gave an interview. The journalist asked him about his success, his career, future projects. But Steve wanted to talk about different things. You know, people say I'm rebellious, that I don't follow rules, that I'm difficult. Maybe they're right, but I'm just trying to be true to myself. Is it possible to be yourself within this system? The journalist asked. Steve smiled, a bitter smile. You can't change the system, but you don't have to force yourself to change either. I'm here to make films, but not to lose myself. When the interview was published, it sparked major debates in Hollywood. Some supported Steve, others criticized him. But Steve didn't care. For the first time, he had spoken his own truth instead of what others thought. What you've seen so far is nothing. When the film was released, it was a huge success. Critics praised Steve's performance. Box office records were broken, and once again, Steve became one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. But for Steve, the real victory was something else. At the film's premiere, when he walked onto the stage, when he heard the applause, he realized something. People weren't just applauding a movie star. They were applauding that spirit of freedom reflected on screen, that sense of rebellion, that authenticity. And for the first time, Steve understood that perhaps complete freedom wasn't possible. But keeping that spirit of freedom alive, inspiring people, was possible. It was early 1968. Steve had started negotiations for a new project, a police film called Bullitt, but this time he had different conditions. When meeting with the producer, Steve put a list on the table. These are my terms. Either you accept them or I'm not in this film. The producer looked at the list. Being his own stuntman, being able to make scene changes, full control in motorcycle and car scenes, having a say in creative decisions. Steve, these are too many demands. No, Steve said firmly. These are my minimum. Either I do this work as myself, or I don't do it at all. You won't believe this, but... The producer hesitated. Then he looked into Steve's eyes. What he saw there wasn't just a star's arrogance. It was an artist's determination to own his work. Okay, the producer said. Deal. And so Bullitt began. And that famous car chase scene became one of the most iconic scenes in cinema history. Because in that scene, Steve wasn't just playing a character. He was himself. Free, controlled, fearless. But success came at a heavy price. Steve's marriage collapsed. He and Neil separated. The nights became even lonelier. His drinking increased. His sleep decreased. One night, an old friend visited him. Steve, you're destroying yourself. Steve laughed. Destroying. I was already destroyed. Now I'm just being honest. But, are you happy?
Steve didn't answer. Happiness. It was a strange word. He had wanted freedom, and somehow he had found it. But happiness, that was something more complex.
I don't know, he finally said. But at least now, I'm myself. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. Years passed. Steve made other films. The Getaway, Papillon, The Towering Inferno. Each was a masterpiece, and in each, Steve worked by his own rules. Hollywood labeled him difficult, but the truth was Steve wasn't just difficult, he was honest, loyal to himself, to his art, to his freedom. And people felt it, because when you watched Steve's films, you didn't just see a story. You saw a spirit, an attitude, a life philosophy. In the late 1970s, Steve began experiencing health problems, but he still didn't stop working. For Le Mans, he went out on the racing track, did dangerous scenes himself. Steve, you're not young anymore, the director said. I know, Steve said, but I'm still me. And he shot those scenes. Each was perfect. Each was proof of Steve's character, discipline, courage. But one night, when filming ended, Steve sat alone in his trailer. He looked at himself in the mirror. The wrinkles had increased, his hair had grayed, But that light in his eyes was still there. Who did I become? He asked himself. Then he laughed. I became Steve McQueen, and nobody could take that away from me. Years later, a young actor watching Steve's old films noticed something. In every scene of Steve's and every look, there was a message. Be free. Stay true to yourself. Don't let the system control you. And when that young actor started his own career, he remembered Steve's lessons, because Steve McQueen wasn't just a star. He represented an era, a spirit, a rebellion. And today, decades later, Steve's films are still being watched, because people are still searching for that freedom, still searching for that honesty, that authenticity, that courage. Steve McQueen died, but his spirit lives on in every frame, every scene, every look. And perhaps that was the real success, within a system writing your own story without losing yourself. When the stage lights went down, Steve McQueen was alone, but that loneliness wasn't a weakness. It was the price of freedom, and Steve was willing to pay that price. Because in the end, everyone is forgotten one day, but Steve McQueen wasn't forgotten, because he didn't just act. He lived. And as long as we remember his story, that spirit of freedom will continue to live.